So before I start, I want to thank Jose Carlos for this invitation. I want to thank Melissa and Stuart for their, warm welcome. And I also want to add that being back in Laredo is a bit nostalgic for me because in the 1990s, this was, I probably passed through here each way 4 or 5 times, either because I was living in Mexico and working as a journalist, or because I was studying at Tulane University in New Orleans, but focusing on Mexico. So it's sort of a symbolic and nostalgic gateway for me, and it's really nice to be back. My area of research is journalism studies in Latin America, but I've always had a strong focus on Mexico. And after working in Mexico and earning my PhD, I wrote a book called Newsrooms and Conflict, Journalism and the Democratization of Mexico that came out in 2006, and it basically looked at transition of Mexican society and journalism from about 1980 to the research ended in about 2004. It tried to describe and explain the emergence of independent, citizen-focused journalism in a number of Mexican newspapers during that period, as well as the rise of market-driven news in the country's 2 television networks. And while it was a largely positive story when it addressed the emergence of this new, more politically plural and sometimes more assertive style of journalism, it also identified challenges to the continued public interest journalism that included authoritarian reversals, and even at that time, the beginnings of what we see now is rampant targeting of journalists by both drug cartels and local politicians who either did not abide by this increasing assertiveness, or simply wanted to silence the entire range of public voices because of criminal activities. So I stepped away from this research for a time, but I returned in 2010, 2011 when I was invited to participate as Mexico team leader for the second rounds of the Worlds of Journalism study. This is an international research consortium that includes more than 60 countries, where researchers agreed to use a common methodology and basic survey instrument to try to capture journalistic cultures, media system structures, and societal conditions that influence journalists' perceived work environments, perceived level of editorial autonomy, their conceptions about what journalism is for in society, and their occupational epistemologies. Now, the Mexico team, which includes my research partner, Mireya Marquez Ramirez from the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City, as well as fairly well-known to many of us journalists and journalism professor Marco Lara Clar, we completed what we believe to be the first generalizable national level survey of organizationally based Mexican journalists based on an in-depth mapping and then stratified random sample of the country's news organizations. Expanding the global survey questionnaire, we added batteries of questions that were important to understanding this context in Mexico. Expanding the types of actors that journalists believed were important influences on their work, looking at broader ranges of coverage where autonomy to produce and develop news might be restricted. And then we added a series of self-reports about steps that Mexican journalists may take to try to remain safe while reporting and distributing news that's more sensitive. While this data is specific to Mexico, however, what I've noticed as I started to try to understand this new context for Mexican journalism is that there's a broader category of countries that are at one time both formally democratic and with democratic institutions that operate imperfectly, but nevertheless are there, and at the same time suffer from really high levels of non-combat violence that are extraordinarily high and ongoing. And I propose, and I want to dig more into this in future research, this creates a level of uncertainty that's extraordinarily high, because on the one hand you have these democratic norms, on the other hand you have this unevenness in how democracy plays out, and then overlaying all that you have this level of risk and threat. So what I want to do today is present some of our Mexico survey findings after setting what I believe is the global context, this broader category of democracies where journalistic work is qualitatively different from the peaceful and relatively more egalitarian democracies where much of the work in journalism studies on democracy, on how the press is supposed to behave, how it does behave, has been developed. If we transfer these theories and findings about journalism and democracy without contemplating levels of risk or insecurity, I think we're missing conditions within which thousands of journalists around the world work. And we also miss what journalism is or is not contributing to the quality of these democracies, and potentially and hopefully the resolution of many of the underlying issues that result in this violence. So the first topic I want to discuss is what I mean by insecurities, or I'm sorry, by insecure democracies, how Mexican journalists perceive insecurity. I'll use our new survey data to talk about how insecurity affects journalists' ability to engage in reporting and publishing news about important actors and issues, and their perception of influences on their work. Then I'll examine how insecurity in multiple forms prompts journalists to alter occupational practice in an attempt to protect themselves, and what that means for journalism's potential contributions to the public sphere. And I'll close by addressing just in a few ways of how I think we should refocus research at this stage, or at least how I hope to engage with this new, this ongoing reality. So what do I mean by insecure democracies? Insecure democracies are political systems that have electoral regimes that transfer power political power at a macro level, but they have uneven performance on other indicators of democracy, such as accountability, protection of civil rights, and they also, at the same time, have been shown around the world to have comparatively high levels of economic inequality and sharp and unrelenting non-combat violence. Insecure democracies have proliferated in the recent 10 to 20 years, and I'll show you some data on that, and have not been explicitly considered in the comparative journalism studies research to address fully the question of why we're seeing these, the emergence of these insecure democracies. Analysts generally agree insecure democracies appear after political liberalization, establishes or reestablishes competitive elections in post-colonial or transitional authoritarian regimes without addressing highly unequal economic structures or reforming justice systems. And I'll briefly summarize these three arguments, which actually can be overlapping. So arguments focusing on state capacity note that following transitions from authoritarian or colonial rule, elected governments lacked the institutional capacity to reform or control de facto powers, including local political factions, professional security forces, and criminal organizations. This created specific geographic arenas or social domains and groups where full democratic protections and the rule of law did not exist or was not evenly enforced and present. Another approach focuses on representation and accountability, and it emphasizes how state policies that violently impose neoliberal economic programs untethered youths and men from social programs and secure formal sector jobs, facilitating their recruitment into criminal organizations. And finally, a third approach views violence, and this is the strongest and most striking argument. It actually argues that violence is endogenous to democracy in societies with high levels of inequality. It says that elections destabilize ruling coalitions of potentially violent actors in societies with sharp inequalities and traditions of politically motivated violence. Violence was unleashed as actors inside and outside the state sought to resist or benefit from the creation of basically a new pax mafioso. In this context, judiciaries and representative bodies either do not work at all or operate in illiberal or corrupt rent-seeking ways. However, at the same time, these analysts also argue that while elections destabilize potentially violent coalitions, democratic institutions can be reformed to help restrain violence, reconstruct the social fabric, and address these underlying social inequalities. So very briefly, there's two macro-level trends over the last 3 decades that suggest that as electoral democracies consolidated without addressing key structural issues, press freedom stalled and even reversed. And you can see from this data, which is from Freedom House's annual survey of press systems around the world, and we can talk about its pros and cons, but you can see that looking over the last 3 decades, countries with a free press environment peaked in 2005 as part of the establishment of more open press systems following transitions in Eastern Europe, in Southern Europe, and Latin America. The number of these not free press systems has essentially remained the same since 1995. But what has grown with the erosion of press freedom in the last decade is the number of countries with press systems with mixed characteristics, these partially free systems. In the last 10 to 12 years, we've seen an expansion globally of these middle-range press systems that mix liberal and more closed authoritarian cues and structures, creating, I hypothesize, a real heightened level of uncertainty for journalists who must sometimes operate in unclear and often contradictory structures with changing norms, with differing role expectations, and with influences on work that change and are hard to gauge. A concurrent development is the appearance, and at least for the last 15 years, stabilization of these so-called uneven democracies. Polity 4 is this long-term attempt to measure democratic performance and regime stability. It goes back to the 1800s, but the emergence of what they call democracies is another of these striking trends over the last 2 decades. These are countries where political power is decided by elections, sort of the minimal threshold of what a democracy is. But they have other shortcomings in the areas I've mentioned: civil liberties, government accountability, full representation. These uneven democracies are a political category that contrasts most notably with full democracies, where accountability, protection of rights, rule of law, representation are more robust and stable. They're also, they also contrast from autocracies where these attributes are not present, and also from what they call, very awkwardly, anocracies, which are authoritarian-leaning regimes that are fairly unstable. So if you compare this with, the Freedom House data, you see, and I've applied the Freedom House data here to the 66 countries I analyzed in the Worlds of Journalism study. 70%, 18 of the democracies in the study have partially free press systems. So there's an overlap. Put it the other way, of the 26 partially free press systems in the survey that we analyzed, 70% are democracies. So 18 are democracies, 5 are full democracies, and 3 are these authoritarian leaning anocracies. So there's an overlap here. And what we see when we look, again, still at the macro level and try to see if we can show in reality that this theoretical idea of an insecure democracy exists, even though it's counterintuitive and we think about what a democracy is supposed to bring, you can see that these uneven democracies tend to feature the highest levels of non-combat violence, the highest levels of inequality, and the highest numbers of assassinated journalists. even compared to autocracies and these unstable authoritarian regimes. And in all cases, the contextual conditions that journalists face in these democracies are very different from what you would see in more peaceful and economically egalitarian democracies. They perceive their context very differently, as also borne out in our survey data when we look across the 66 countries. So let's leave the macro vision, and I think I've made the point that while Mexico is unique in many ways, there's this wider trend going on. And ask the question, how Mexican journalists then perceive influences from insecurity. And our method was a national survey of journalists working in organizational settings and receiving the majority of their pay from editorial responsibilities. So we're not talking about independent bloggers. We're not talking about community media volunteers. They express public interest aspirations, even about a wide range of actors, but they're much more cautious about sources of anti-press violence. And they perceive different levels of freedom to report about powerful actors depending on what the source of their power is. I don't think I have time to talk about the survey sample description, but I can send you a very detailed descriptive report. I would just point out that we stratified by the type of media outlet, and we have about 30% of the sample is female, and about, I can't read it very well, but 60% are rank and file journalists compared to 40% of different levels of management. So the journalists we find, despite this horrible context, which you all know, do express level of support for different types of journalistic roles that are associated with public interest journalism. We can talk about, is it social change oriented? Is it more watchdog or oriented? But if you look at the top 10, and we asked about 25 different roles and their degree of support for roles, you can see aspirationally what they tell us. The majority support in the highest levels these public interest norms. At the bottom, if you can see this, the least supported roles are things like providing entertainment, supporting government policies, and then you have monitoring criminal organizations. It's really something that happens within the organization, and this is how journalism studies, coming out of the Western, stable, peaceful democracies, has operationalized professional autonomy. If you get to choose your stories and what to emphasize, you have autonomy. But we added questions saying, well, does that apply evenly to the type of story you're working on? And you can see that it does not, right? So yes, these are subjective responses. It's your perceived level of freedom to report about these things, but you can argue that perceptions drive behavior, or at least are strongly related to them. So the lowest levels of perceived autonomy to publish news occurred when stories are about actors associated with physical insecurity, right? Criminal organizations, and sadly, this is for the next round, we didn't have police. We do have the military, and I know that the Navy and the Army have different roles, but nevertheless, those are the two where journalists feel they have the least level of autonomy. We then followed up and asked, like I mentioned before, a series of yes-no questions on changes in professional practice to reduce risk, as well as an open-ended question about other measures they undertook within the last 5 years to protect themselves. We got 147 responses in the other category, and we categorized them qualitatively to 12 different types of risk reduction practice. So this table reports responses to whether journalists engaged in a precautionary or protective practice in the last 5 years. And while almost all journalists reported paying greater attention to accuracy when a story is potentially sensitive, good for democracy, good for professionalism, about 2/3 of journalists reported having engaged in self-censorship as a precaution to reduce risk. Retiring from street reporting was the next most prevalent. Again, about 2/3 engaged in this behavior. That was followed by company censorship policies, at 57% of journalists saying that they had done that at least once in the last 5 years. 2 more precautionary measures followed: hiding information from suspicious characters in the newsroom, which always provokes discussion, and publishing without byline or credit in your own media. Less frequently were filtering ideas to international media, publishing stories abroad, or publishing anonymously on social media. So I think that the results from this battery of questions, if you look at the type of responses, clearly show that the most common precautionary practices prevent news stories from being disseminated or even being developed. Precautions take place while developing or disseminating stories, though that's the group of types of behaviors that follows. Least common are practices that actively seek to disseminate stories that already exist through alternative and less risky channels. So what we're seeing is that perceptions of insecurity, the strongest effect is to shut down reporting and dissemination of news rather than seeking ways to disseminate it more safely. So we then ran some statistical procedures, logistic regression, to identify, well, what predicts these different measures? You know, is it really only physical security? And what a logistic regression will do is identify whether a variable significantly increases or decreases the likelihood or the odds that an outcome will happen. In this case, for example, self-censorship or something like that. So what this table does is categorize types of risk, and you know, if you want to get into the details, we can talk about whether they're categorized correctly as physical, economic, political, etc. And then simply report them as they predict different types of protective practice. And what we see then is physical insecurity disrupts or completely shuts down news production. Invisibility, we believe it was invisibility in smaller cities, also increases censorship, isolation, invisibility. Economic insecurity short circuits public interest journalism, but in contrast to physical risk, it leaves open some space to distribute sensitive stories anonymously on social media. Publishing abroad or anonymously on social media as less risky alternatives were disproportionately available to younger journalists, and in the case of publishing abroad, to newsroom executives. Very interestingly, logically when you think about it, but it was a surprise in the data, journalists who self-identified as indigenous, we asked, one, do you identify with an ethnic do you have an ethnic identity? If so, what is it? And then we had an open-ended category. We categorized them. We had about 15 different indigenous groups mentioned. It was about 10% of the sample. They, more than others, or the odds increased at the highest level. If you're an indigenous journalist, you were much more likely, let me say it that way, to use digital tools and perhaps tap international solidarity networks to circumvent what we think is both discrimination within the professional newsroom as well as to report on sensitive topics. So, summing up, you know, the study shows the effects of insecurity on journalists as human beings, because many of the practices they reported involved changing home life and social life routines, but also journalists' potential contributions to democratic quality. And anybody who reads free press reports or works in this area knows that there's many policy prescriptions that have already been put in place, like special prosecutors, protection mechanisms, and the like, that still are not working. They're either not put into place or they're not effective. So we need to sort of, at this point, I think, refocus research on why. At least if we want to, if we work in applied fields and we want to have real world results. You know, we can do case studies of places where the protection mechanism works and where it doesn't. We can apply social science techniques to these questions. I also think we need to look comparatively because there are some insights that are not immediately visible when you look only in depth at one country that may come out through comparative analysis. So one of the more interesting things I've done of late was compare both the huge global sample, but then look at case studies that fit this pattern of insecure democracy. But not in all cases were journalists targeted. So the cases we looked at were Colombia, El Salvador, Mexico, Botswana, South Africa. So only in Mexico and Colombia were the journalists targeted in high numbers. And one of the differences was that at the local level, even though all the countries had high level of crime, the journalists were being targeted by state actors who were involved in crime. So where the state at the local level is involved in criminal activities is where the journalists are covering these, that's where you're getting the crime. It's either geographically distant in the other countries or the local level officials don't seem to be involved. So that's just the sort of thing that you get by looking at comparative analysis that doesn't always come out when you're looking at single countries. And then in terms of just improving the method, number of things about the questionnaire that need to be improved. It was a pilot. Obviously, and someone will ask, surveys have strengths, but they also have weaknesses. We're talking about perceptions. We took all the measures we could to enhance trust and security, but you know, in the end, we rely on people to respond completely and honestly and thoughtfully. So, you know, I go back to what I've always believed, that systematic mixed method approaches are the best way to get at a phenomenon. They require more time. We have to be creative about how we do them. I know that working, and I so respect my colleagues in journalism studies who do this on the ground in Mexico because, you know, they're living these insecure environments, but I do believe that that's the best way to get at a better understanding of this very complex and unfortunately increasingly common phenomenon. So I hope I didn't go too long.